every time we say goodbye, my dear. I don't know why it's so unclear. Your mouth says go away, but your body's telling me to stay. I don't know just what to do.
Hello everybody, and welcome to There and Then. I'm your host, Don Gutteridge. This is a podcast where we take a look at the collected works of one Canadian author, namely my grandfather, Don Gutteridge, and find out what inspires him, what inspired him to write, and to put his work in the context of Can Lit as a whole. We're not here to dissect or fine-tooth comb his work. It's more about us spending a little time enjoying the work and spending some time together. Today we're going to be looking at 3 books of poetry that are actually Grandpa's most recent. They are Tidings, Inundations, and The Blue Flow Below, all published within the last 2 years. Now, Grandpa's coming up on 80 at this point, but he's still cranking out poetry like there's no tomorrow. So he's had these 3 collections in the last 2 years, and I think he actually has 3 more in the works. Now, the nice thing about these works is they're actually in print. So a lot of the stuff we've talked about so far and will talk about in the future is no longer in print. So you can get some of his work in ebooks, and other than that, you're kind of stuck with Amazon or the used bookstore market, which is fine. The work's out there, but these books are currently in print and available for all those that are interested. Now, if you've never read any of Grandpa's poetry before, there's a few ways you could define it, but what I like to say is it's spare and it's moving. I think you'll find that all through what we talk about. So, without any further ado, let's get to my conversation with Don.
Would you stop me saying no, no, no? I guess I'll stay on by a little longer.
I'm here with my grandfather, Don Gutteridge. How are you, Grandpa?
I'm fine, thanks, Tom.
Well, it's very good to see you. We've been working through some technical issues this afternoon, but we're into it now. How are you today?
I'm fine, thanks. Ready to go.
Great. Well, so basically the name of the game today is we're going to be talking about 3 of Don's most recent poetry collections. Tidings from 2016, Inundations from 2016, and The Blue Flow Below from 2017, all available from Black Moss Press in Canada. So we've talked about what you refer to as the 3-beat structure to your poetry. What do you mean when you say that? I was trying to get my head around it.
Whenever you read a line, there's 3 strong stresses. There could be any number of other syllables. So there's no basic iambic beat or trochaic beat. It could be any of those beats.
Yeah.
But as soon as I feel the 3rd stress, I feel the need to break the line.
And then you jump to your next line.
And sometimes it allows certain flourishes that work. And sometimes it's just mechanical.
So you said it was right around the year 2000. Was there anything that drove you to start using that 3-beat structure, or was it just, did it just come to you?
Actually, I was so busy writing the mystery series, which I wrote in the first 2 were published in 2004. So I must have been writing them around 2002, 2003.
Right.
And I wasn't writing any poetry, and so I had all of the large poetry projects, like the True History of Lambton County and the God's Geography and the and the Mythics. Those were gone in the past, and I thought, I don't think I'm ever going to write any poetry again.
Right.
So when I started, these little short poems came out.
Right.
And of course, you can write them in about 20 minutes, and then I let them sit for a day, and then I rework them. Yep. But it doesn't take very long, so you can do them just before I go to bed. I sometimes write a poem in my head and then write it out in the morning.
Yeah, well, it's amazing how quickly you can crank out poems based on. So it's a form that allows you to be extremely prolific.
It does, and basically it starts with. I usually sit in this chair and I think of some person or event in the past, or sometimes not quite so likely, but it's maybe an event in the present will trigger something I see on TV or whatever. But mostly it's thinking about Point Edward and the characters and my family.
Yeah.
Well, as I say, I like the speed with which I can complete a 12 to 16 line poem and have the same, not quite the same satisfaction as doing an epic, but to get the same satisfaction a poet gets when he's completed something. And the other thing, of course, is that one of the poets I admire the most is Emily Dickinson, who never wrote a poem over 12 lines.
Yes, no, Dickinson poems are always...
Yeah.
Bang, 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 quick.
Yeah. And she wrote 1,500 of them.
Yeah. Well, and you and I were just discussing that you're up around the same at this point.
Yeah, around the same.
That's funny. Yours have titles as opposed to just numbers, but...
Right.
Okay. The one thing I find really interesting about these poems is there's not a lot of what I would call... I don't want it to sound derogatory because it's not, but there's not a lot of dramatic flourish to any of it.
No.
It's very... And I don't want to say raw either because it's polished, but it's spare.
Spare, that's right, yeah.
Yeah, and that's one of the thing I think one of its great strengths, and that's something that I have yet to be able to accomplish.
And it's quite opposite to the poems, say, in True History, where I have a much longer, what I call a natural line, where there's a natural break in the thought. Is where you break the lines. And they tend to flow and be thicker and longer and have more imagery to them.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, they're a great example of what I think of as your later work, and I'm really happy that people are still able to access them. I took a lot of what I wanted to talk about from Tidings, just because I found that it had a lot of the... It instantiated a lot of these themes really well, so it's a bit more heavily represented than the other two in the examples I have.
Right.
If you can think of any others, I'll dig for them. Grandpa and I both have our books at hand, so we'll be digging for quotes here, and we're just going to kind of sort of freeform our way through it and see what we get, but there's a lot of interesting stuff to talk about here. So I'm going to preface this with, basically, in my life, our family was not a member of any religious denomination. It's not been something I was raised in. We didn't go to church. That wasn't something that we did. I don't think it was it didn't ever feel conscious to me. It just seemed like something that we didn't do.
Right.
But in these books, your past experience in the church looms large in many places.
Yeah, we went to Sunday school from the time we were 6 years old, and when we moved to Chatham in 1952, I went to the United Church there even as a teenager.
Yeah.
And then I lost my faith suddenly when I was 19.
Yeah.
And started studying philosophy and reading Plato and Aristotle.
Like so many of us,
Yeah.
that first run of philosophy sometimes does the higher power in to some extent.
I think as you age, you do think back to your youth. In fact, when I go out to lunch with my older friends, we spend a lot of time talking about times that happened a long, long time ago.
Yeah.
But of course, your childhood experiences, your innocence moving into experience, is a life-changing moments for people.
Yep.
And that's why they induce poems. They're so powerful. When I think back to them, and the hymn singing, and I went to a Methodist church, which was initially, which was where we had a lay minister, and we'd actually, and then we would have religious story time in the evenings with the old felt boards. I don't know whether you've ever heard of them, where they put figures of Christ and.
I have heard. This is something I have seen in media.
Yeah.
I've never seen it in real life.
Yeah, well, I've seen them up close, and that's how we learn the Bible stories.
In some older movies, you see that.
Yeah.
You see that as a representation. So, one poem I wanted to talk about is a poem called Galilee. It's on number
I'm
13
at
of
it.
Tidings. Okay, great. I'm actually just going to read it through, just because it's not long, and there's a few things I want to touch on in here. So, this poem is called Galilee. For 100 Sundays and more, I became acquainted with God, His Son, and the blood of the Lamb, of which we were all washed clean, with lurid tales of Adam and Eve, rambunctious in Eden, with Zacharias trembling in a tree, with luckless saints who beat the odds and the occasional flood, with David, whose pious pebble bested Goliath, with Samson's plucky locks in Delilah's severing scissors, and of course, with Jesus, pinned horrific on Golgotha, images that fired my fancy and drew me, dazzled, out of my wayward village 10,000 miles from Galilee. This is one of my favorite poems from the collection, but the thing that I got from this is clearly, at least when you're thinking back to your adolescent self, the importance of stories is already huge. It's not as if you seem to be afraid of, or it's not like you're compelled by the moralist parts of religion. It's more the stories you're being told.
The stories, yeah. Like Zacharias in his tree was an image. At the end of Sunday school each Sunday, we got a paper, a little 4-sheet broadside with one of the stories and a couple of drawings. And I had a whole collection of these. And that's where the little stories come from.
Yeah. You certainly, in this poem, you get a sense of that child's view of the stories they're receiving.
And it's one of the poems I actually still like.
It's a good one. It's very strong. There's another poem from one of your later from one of the other collections we were discussing, and we can read a little bit of it after. But there was another poem called Our Side. I think that one is from the Blue Flow. Grandpa, is it all right if I read it?
Sure.
All right. So this poem's called Our Side. Saturday was matinees at the Aging Imperial, double feature day, the third balcony condemned, but who cared? We came to be dazed and bedazzled by Hopalong and Roy, untroubled by six-gun mayhem in sagas where the villains died bloodlessly for our entertainment, and the Bowery boys kept us in stitches till the cartoon catapulted in color on the screen, when we waited breathlessly for the Indians to arrive, war-whooping a chill through our collective bones. But when the cavalry came, roaring, scattering redskins far and wide, we roared right back, our cheers visceral, reminding us that once again, God was on our side. This is another one of your poems that it takes me a few places in my head. Because I've always been fascinated by your descriptions of these rowdy matinees when you were young.
Oh, yeah.
That was a huge part of your life.
Yeah. I mean, when the good guy or the cavalry arrived, the whole lower tier of the theater would rise up and holler and scream, yay, yay, yay.
Yeah.
So, and that's what I missed about television. It's a quiet, sort of usually isolating activity. You might be with 2 or 3 other members of your family, but these were communal responses to really bad movies.
And so that was the staple of your life in Point Edward. I imagine you would have missed that when you moved out to the Fourth Line.
No, we used to walk about a quarter of a mile from where we lived in the beginning of the countryside to the train station where we caught the bus that took us downtown. Yeah. And we would spend the whole afternoon there because you had a double feature, usually a serial, and then a cartoon. Yeah. And it would go on for maybe 2.5 hours. And then we would come out, go to the chip wagon, get some chips,
Yeah.
and then catch the bus back and walk home again. But
okay.
And sometimes we were there all day because the Odeon Theater had what they called a Saturday morning club.
Yeah.
So sometimes we would take our lunch with us,
Oh, wow.
and we would see usually a J. Arthur Rank British film,
Yeah.
which Odeon was,
Mm-hmm.
and then have our lunch, and then go to the Imperial and sit there for the afternoon. But of course, you didn't sit there. That was the whole point. You jumped up and down and jumped around.
It's way closer to a concert than a movie, as as I think of it now.
That's a good analogy, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Which I missed, of course. I've never been to a rock concert.
They're all right. They hurt your ears. Yeah, they're all right. That was I just wanted to touch on that just because the importance of narrative in these poems, and not just the narrative you're playing out, but the importance of stories in your mind is obvious through all of these.
Yeah, the way I look at my own poems are that they have a narrative movement to them.
Mm-hmm.
They start at the beginning and they go to the middle and the end, and then there's usually a little rounding off or a little punchline at the end of them, and quite often they're just one long sentence.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think the ones that I've read so far give a good sense of that, because I can, when I read it out loud, I hear the tenses better.
Yeah.
And that's helping me understand how you're constructing them. I think
Right.
maybe I ought to be reading them out loud to myself, because I was having trouble hearing it, but then when I read them, I hear it well. And it's not like you're timing the stresses particularly.
No.
There just is three of them.
There's three of them. They're there.
And then you bounce to another line.
And they read well when I do public readings.
Yes.
They read very well.
Yes. They're captivating, and they're not overly long. So you can stay engaged for the
Yeah.
duration.
And the narrative movement comes from the poetry of Al Purdy, which
Yeah.
I admired in my youth,
Yeah.
and for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And not all of his poems, but many of them have a narrative movement to them, and I was quite struck by that.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that I noticed a lot in these poems is, mostly in relation to the Point Edward stuff, is it seems like when you think about Point Edward, it's almost oftentimes we're relating to things in the context of the environment of Point Edward, and I feel like the lake is a huge motif for you. It pops up constantly.
Right.
And the connection to the beach as well at Canatera.
Yeah.
You would have spent a lot of time there when you were
Yeah.
young.
Again, we would go after lunch,
Mm-hmm.
and we always had to wait an hour because the myth was you would drown.
Yeah, you'd drown if you went swimming.
Once the hour was up,
Yeah.
we would spend that first hour in the park playing around in Canatera Park, which is a beautiful spot.
Mm-hmm.
And then at 1 o'clock we would head down to the beach.
Yep.
We would swim for maybe an hour or so, and then we would come out, play on the dunes, and then occasionally go back and play in the park.
Yeah.
And in those days, when I was a youngster until I was 11 and moved away,
Mm-hmm.
we were only a 15-minute walk from Canatera Park.
Yeah.
So we were there almost every day of the summer,
Yeah.
except when we had storms or something like that kept us away. But yeah, we were there all the time. Our parents just shoved us out the door and said, "Go swim."
Mm-hmm.
And Canatera was safe because they had a lifeguard.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
And I was not a swimmer like you.
Well, this was my question. There's a couple of poems you have about not being able to swim.
Right.
When did you learn?
When I was 12.
Okay.
And all my friends knew how to swim. I was a non-swimmer.
Mm-hmm. You got there, and you didn't drown, so that's
I didn't
good.
drown.
I had the bonus of being thrown in the pool when I was 5, and and got it from there. It's really some of my favorite poems in these collections are the ones that touch on this. One I wanted to start with because I think this is probably a good time for us to move into the meat of the Point Edward stuff. There's a poem that I think bears reading. I was wondering if you would read this one. And it is called Homegrown. It's on 12 of Tidings.
Yeah, I've got it.
Great. Would you be able to read that for me,
Sure.
Grandpa? Thank you.
My village made me what I came to be, the curve of Canatera's bountiful beach, the infinite surge of Huron Lake, the marshes below the angular bridge spanning the blue cadence of our river, while meadows bounced with bobolinks near a park where we played until the evening evaporated. These were all of God's geography I would need to track the terrain of a story, or the swerve of a poem with my cartographer's eye, or people them with characters even Dickens would die for. Homegrown and inadvertently comic, they acted out the minor flaws of their little lives, as if I were the only one watching, and beguiling the village air with my grateful applause.
Do you ever remember things you had forgotten about town at this point in your life, or do you think you've picked it clean?
Yes and no. Yes, there are times when I'm sitting and thinking that a memory will come that I haven't thought about before for a very, very long time.
Yep.
But I literally do memory exercises where I go back through a time or a street or an event or something like that.
Oh yeah.
And what was the second half of your question?
Well, my second half of the question was and this sort of answers it. I'm just interested in how you managed to remember all of this.
Oh, yeah, well, I literally do memory exercises.
Okay.
Where I think back to the point. And then, of course, when I went there 2 years ago with my friend Gene, some new memories emerged as I looked at old buildings and old houses and people who lived in them.
Yeah.
And so on.
Because that's the part I find fascinating. Like, I have a hard time remembering this level of detail of my childhood, which is 30 years ago. We're talking 75 years ago for you.
Yeah.
And you see, you're able to pull these lucid memories out. And it's one of the things that I find really captivating about these collections is the lucidity with which you seem to remember all this stuff. I guess the thing I always wonder about is this all feels bittersweet to me. I don't know if you feel the same.
Yes.
A lot of it is happy.
Yeah.
But it's elegiac in a way.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. You've caught the juncture of the two moods that yeah. And of course there's a lot of sadness. Some of the characters led very, very sad lives.
Well, and that leads me nicely into what I wanted to talk about next. There's a strong current of there really were many tragic characters in Point Edward, and
there were.
You approach sort of Southern Gothic levels of sadness when I think about the lives some of these people were living.
Yeah.
But I think the part that I find really fascinating is you're always able to pull something relatable out of it. There's a poem I'm going to look for here.
I was thinking of Bob and John McCord, two brothers, both of whom were alcoholic.
Yeah.
Bob all his life, John towards the end of his life.
Yeah.
And I thought, golly, I'll just go around the block. And I counted up 7
that you could think of
alcoholics within 2 to 3 blocks of my house.
Yeah. Yeah, and so this is a poem called Stone's Throw. It's out of the collection Inundations. Stone's Throw. There were 7 alcoholics within a stone's throw of my house. The wastage of war, or the daily drudgery of the 6-day week, took its toll on the men we spotted on the streets, teetering home from the Balmoral, or sipping silently in forlorn kitchens, bereft of any hope or pride. We viewed them as something other than ourselves, alien adults to be mocked or pitied, but never encountered, by chance or design, without the shock of recognition, the sideways glance that made them human. That is a very, it's it's impactful, absolutely.
Yeah, it's a very moving poem, isn't it?
It is very moving, and that was the reality of
Yeah.
those people's lives.
Well, I would see Bob McCord staggering home from the Balmoral Hotel, where he stayed until closing time at 6:30.
Yeah.
I changed it to 6 o'clock, but his closing time was 6:30.
Yeah.
And he would stagger in front of our house. His house was just across the street from ours.
Yep.
But every once in a while, he would sort of turn his head and give a little grin.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what prompted that poem.
Yeah. Well, it's funny that you can
So
pick that out.
Most of the poems are prompted by an event like that. But it started out with the Count.
Yeah. And this is and maybe it's because I've been sort of reading works in what would be called the Southern Gothic genre a little bit more recently, but some of this has that flavor to it. The petty cruelties and the little the small horrors of a small town come across in a lot of these poems.
Yeah.
Now there's another one I'm going to look for now, called Sutures. Sutures is another very,
I
very
almost
moving
know
poem.
that one by heart.
Yeah. Well, if we can find it, would you mind reading it for me? It's in both. It's in two of these.
It's just I realized that when I was going.
Yeah, Sutures is good enough. So nice. He published it twice.
I was going. Well, I say I've written so many poems, and of course the titles are often just one word, which doesn't give you an awful lot of insight into the nature of the poem. Is it in?
I think it's in Tidings, if I'm not mistaken.
I think it's certainly in Tidings.
And it might reappear in the Blue Flow, so it actually skipped one.
Yeah, I think it is. I can find it in the Blue Flow.
Because so we're flipping through now, and Grandpa was just mentioning how a lot of these poems just have either a 1 or a 2 word title, and so it's not giving us much in the way of context clues. It can be hard to find what we're looking for. There we are.
Sutures. My grandfather's surgeon was celebrated all over town, but he was also addicted to the drink, and in the OR he sometimes reached for a taut and found a scalpel in his fist. And so it was the man I loved the most was butchered, his blood pouring out through the sutures, while his surgeon wondered where his whiskey was.
And so this must be an actual event.
Yeah, it is.
What happened?
Well, Dr. Roberts was the surgeon. He was a known alcoholic.
Yeah.
And my grandfather had a prostate operation, which was successful.
Yeah.
But the night after the operation, the sutures broke.
Yeah.
And he was bleeding. And
Yeah.
he bled to death on the operating table.
When they were trying to stop
When they
it.
were trying to stop the blood.
My God.
But he must have botched the operation initially
Yeah.
for that to have happened.
Yeah. There's he would have had to be in a vessel or something.
Yeah.
And so was it to treat prostate cancer?
This was prostate cancer. Yeah.
Yeah.
It may have saved him a horrible year of dying slowly with cancer, but no, I know. I was a teenager then, but
yeah.
I often heard my grandmother talk about this infamous Dr. Roberts as being a man who took a lot of drink.
Yeah.
And often operated when he shouldn't have.
Yes. Well, and this is again that is I mean fits right in with the darkness that lurks in these in these smaller places, right? Would he have been a surgeon up in Sarnia?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And probably one of the few surgeons at that small hospital. Yeah.
And this would have been in the early 50s?
1955.
Mid-50s. Yeah, and so that's back in a time where you probably still could be an alcoholic surgeon, and they exist today too, but
yeah,
in those days you could be a known alcoholic and still be allowed to practice.
And he was known because the family talked about him, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the darkest poems in the collection, absolutely. That's not one you would have had to do a memory exercise for.
No.
No. That's I mean, it is a very good poem. It is incredibly moving. It is incredibly sad. The first time, and then of course I got hit with it twice because it appears in 2 of these collections.
Yeah.
And so there it is again, and I read through it again because it's a good one. Now there is one, and we don't necessarily need to read the whole poem, but I need to hear about Lou. I need to know about Lou.
Oh, about Lou. Yeah,
Who was Lou, Grandpa?
Lou was my dad's best friend.
Yeah.
And Lou owned his own business.
Yeah.
And was by Chatham standards, that's where we lived.
Yeah.
He was quite wealthy.
Yeah.
And so he would take my mother and dad out and often treat them. And,
Yeah.
We were just living hand to mouth in those days.
Yeah.
But Lou loved to party, and my dad built a rec room downstairs, and Lou and his wife, whose name has slipped from my mind, M, I think her name was, Lou and M.
Mm-hmm.
They would come to parties, and Lou was obsessed with guns.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad would often open the cabinet. He had them in a locked cabinet.
As he should, yes.
A 30-07 and shotguns.
Yeah.
And Lou would handle them and lovingly, and I've seen him do it and so on. And one night, we were my brother and I were in bed, but we heard the shot. It was heard all over Orchard Heights, where we lived.
So
he shot it straight up in the air.
I could not believe that. Okay, I'm just gonna read it because it is such a good poem. Lou, Dad's pal Lou loved 2 things: fishing and guns. But his wife put the kibosh on the latter, and so when he came calling, he pinned his peepers on Dad's collection of rifles, safely cribbed in their cabinet, until one evening, fully in his cups, Lou seized a 30-06 and at midnight in our backyard discharged his prize gleefully straight into the air, interrupting the shut-eye of an entire neighborhood while his laughter could be heard long after the echo of the shot had faded away, and we all gave up guessing where that bullet had landed.
I remember we did wonder whose roof it.
Yeah.
Whose roof it.
Well, and a 30-06 is a fairly substantial firearm.
It's an elephant gun. It's a powerful. My dad let me shoot it. It just about took my shoulder off.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest, heaviest cartridges around in an average rifle, and he fired it straight in the air. That would have been loud, really loud. That it's not so much that poem relates much to any of what I was talking about, but it's a little bit more of the humor that I love about your poems coming through.
Well, my dad had another Lou, and I don't know, it's in one of the earlier collections. There's a poem about him fishing too.
Yeah.
And my dad had quite a collection of pals.
Mm-hmm.
But
well,
fishing was big. My dad was a fisherman, and Lou often went with him.
And Grandpa or great-grandpa loved hunting.
Yeah, he loved hunting.
And he was trying to get you to hunt.
He was trying to get me to hunt. He did not have any success at all.
There's a few poems in here about him trying to get you to hunt rabbits. You never successfully shot one.
Never did, no.
Good man, Grandpa.
I always missed.
Yep. Well, I mean, I have no interest in it.
No, I had no interest at all. No.
I occasionally in the line of duty will have to wield a firearm, but
you see, I didn't meet my dad until I was 8, and so bonding was really difficult. And he was trying to. I was a horrible athlete, and that would have been an instant bonding with him if I could have been a hockey player or something like that. So it was an attempt to bond.
Yeah,
it didn't work.
And I mean, he was just so the martial man's man, right?
Yeah.
Hockey and hunting and taxidermy, which was something I only learned recently, was that's what he was into.
Yeah.
And you were already a scholar in the making at that point. So
well, my brother was artistic and painted.
Yeah.
And I was an intellectual and wrote poems.
Yeah.
And so it was pretty hard for my dad.
Yeah. Who
failed grade 8 3 times.
Did he?
Yeah. And quit school at 16.
Yep. Yeah. There's a lot of that dynamic in this in this, and that motif of you guys trying to rabbit hunt, it comes up in a lot of these poems. I think there's at least 3 I can think of.
Yeah, I just wrote another one a few days ago about my uncle and I.
Yeah.
My uncle Potsy took me hunting, and but I cheated a little bit because he just took me along. I didn't have a gun.
You didn't actually.
In the poem, I actually have a gun.
Right.
And and I've written a lot of poems about Potsy, of course, who was very special.
So Potsy is Uncle Bob.
Uncle Bob, yeah.
He was the youngest of your dad's brothers?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a really good poem, which I'm trying to find. Oh, it's called Losing You, and it is probably near the end of 49 of Tidings. Would you be willing to read that one for me, Grandpa?
Sure.
Great.
Losing You, for Uncle Potsy in memoriam. You built your own house, block by cinder block. You leveled them with an eye as keen as a cartographer's and a mind that could calculate angles and eaves as precise as a prism. You put no stock in newfangled gadgets, relying only on the heft and timber of your woodman's hands. And the home-built structure stood for 50 years until they bulldozed it for a parking lot. And I pass that vacant space now as if what you created had never been there for most of a lifetime. And, like losing you, I am bereft.
Yeah, that's a beautiful poem. I was very, very moved by it. Now, I was lucky enough that, unlike my younger brothers, I actually got a chance to meet Potsy.
Yes, you did.
He would have been in his 70s at that point, I think.
Yeah.
And I believe Betty lasted a little longer, so his wife.
She died before him.
Oh, she did.
Yeah, she did. He lived on his own.
Yeah.
For about 3 years. He died 3 years after her. He died because of the lung infection he got from working at the Imperial Oil.
Yeah.
It was like a form of asbestosis.
Yeah. Yeah, pneumoconiosis, they call that.
Yeah, and he was as healthy as a horse.
Well, he was still very vigorous when my first memories of him.
Oh, yeah.
He didn't look his age.
I played golf with him when he was 80, so.
Yeah. What was he like? When did you develop such a special bond with Potsy?
Right from the time I can remember being a child, when my first memories, he took to me right at the beginning.
Yeah.
And I was born in 37. He was born in 25. So he was only 12 years my senior.
Yeah.
So he was like a big brother, and he was always like a big kid, clowning around.
Yeah.
And
even into his later years.
He took a special liking to me. I think probably he liked me before I realized how powerful an influence he was on my life. But I remember he bought me my first football as a birthday present. It was probably the best birthday present I had ever gotten up to that time.
Yeah.
And we used to play around in the backyard with the ball, and then he started taking me along with the family when they went to Cameron Lake.
Okay.
In 1949. I was only 12 or 13 when I first went to Cameron Lake, and that's why it plays such an important role in my life and poems.
Well, I think we're gonna have to do a standalone just on Cameron Lake
Cameron
alone.
Lake, yeah.
Well, and that sort of explains why you loved Cameron Lake so much.
Yeah. I was only maybe 14 when we first went there, and there was nothing there at that time. His cottage and his father-in-law's cottage were the first cottages on the lake.
Yep.
So it was really very primitive. There was no electricity. We had gas lamps
And so for a little bit of context, Cameron Lake is the lake that adjoins Cypress Lake, just near Tobermory. Now, Cypress Lake, in the intervening years, has become a booming place.
Right.
I don't know when the last time you were at Cypress was, maybe in the 90s at some point. Yeah, we went on a weekend this past year, full of people. We were cheek to jowl on the trails.
Wow.
It was still beautiful. It is so different than it was when I was young.
It was uninhabited when we were there, and I've written a poem about moving through the creek and about my Uncle Potsy, and it's in the collection that's coming out.
Oh, great.
It's the story of my uncle and I going through the creek that joins the two lakes, Cameron and Cypress, and going into the completely pristine Cypress, being the only two people on this entire lake fishing.
Wow. Because you aren't even allowed to fish in Cypress anymore.
Is that right?
No fishing, no power boats. Just, yeah, you can still fish in Cameron, but you can't fish in Cypress anymore. It's because even when I was young, you can still paddle the creek. Water level dependent.
Yeah, we often have to pole our way through. Yeah.
But you can still make that transition, but Cypress is now under the auspices of the National Park System.
Right.
So you actually can't fish there anymore.
No.
So that's, that's an experience that no one will get anymore. So it's amazing. It's amazing that you got that. I'm very happy about that. So Potsy built his own house in Point Edward?
He built his own house, and he built his own cottage on Cameron Lake.
He built that cottage as well?
He built that cottage, yeah.
Wow.
He built it entirely himself.
It's still standing.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a beautiful place. I mean, I'm very grateful that we can still go. They do have guest cottages there, so
yeah.
I'll continue to take my family there, absolutely, because it's certainly one of the most beautiful places in Ontario. And it's, of course, got a strong... I of course, am strongly nostalgic for it as well. Yeah, well, that's amazing. I mean, I just think if there's any justice in the world, people like Potsy get recognized, because he was a fantastic guy.
Yeah, very talented.
Very talented. And he was also involved in the war effort, right?
Yeah, he was 17 when he went overseas.
And I remember you telling me a story that he was a guard or something like that, right? At an air base?
Up in Scotland, in one of those big inlets that they used as a Navy base.
At a Navy base.
And his job, he was only 18 years old, was to sit in the hull of one of these ships, and with a gun.
Yeah.
And if the Nazis arrived, he was to shoot them.
Huh.
Imagine being 18 years old, sitting there all by yourself at night, waiting for the Nazis to arrive.
Well, and he was over in England, because your dad was in Goose Bay, right?
Yeah, he was in Goose Bay, yeah.
And so that's, it was far enough away, but Potsy was even closer to the action.
Yeah, he was. Uncle Tom was in it.
Yeah, and Uncle Tom was in it.
Uncle Tom was in it.
Yeah. Well, I always like talking about Potsy, because he's clearly one of the figures in the family that I of course I venerate because you did, but he was a really great guy. And I think to this day that's probably the only time I've ever been on a sailboat. But I think there's photographic evidence of me on that sailboat somewhere. I'll see if
somewhere.
Now, the one thing that's great is I hope that as people start to listen to this, I'm going to be able to go digging through some photo albums and find some evidence of all this stuff, because Grandpa did a really good job of compiling a lot of photos from the early years, and we certainly have some photo evidence of a lot of this stuff. Now, one other poem I want to touch on before we sort of sum up what we've been talking about is a poem called "The Point."
Oh, right.
"The Point" is as close to an epic poem as you get these days. So you'll recognize some of the characters we meet in this poem. Would you be all right with reading that for me, Grandpa?
Sure.
Great.
The Point. Dickens would have loved the Point. The streets bristled with characters who would have been at home in Pickwick or Oliver Twist. There was Bob McCord, who haunted the beverage room, closed the joint every day at 6 on the dot, and whistled his way down the main drag. Or Ruby Carr, who rescued Rags, combing the alleys and byroads on her barnacled bike, and talking to every tree she managed to miss. Or Butch McCord, who battled bullies on my behalf and taught me the meaning of boyhood friendship. Or Cap Harness, who never saw a sea-going ship or the sea, but cut the hair of the whole village between salty anecdotes. or Harry Fisher, whose yard overflowed with elderly stoves and assorted pots, like the maelstrom of his mind, and the memories of gunfire and bomb blasts sullen sun. Or Herbie Gilbert, in his tin pot Lizzie, honking his ooga-ooga horns at every second passers-by, just to say he was alive and thriving. And there was Pussy Carr, Rip Kemsley, Long Tom Shaw, and a dozen other nicknamed denizens who made my town a place to grow up in and have some fancy tickled and fed.
Yeah, it's got to be one of the longest poems in any of these collections.
That's true. And I read it at the reading. It went over really well.
Well, I'm sure.
No, we had, there were two captains, Captain Beaton,
Yep.
who was on the harmonic, and Cap Garvey, who was an older man in his late 70s. But Beaton was a younger man, and he was on the harmonic when it burned in 1945.
And Garvey was the one that survived that storm.
Yeah, he survived the storm.
Right.
But Beaton was the hero of the harmonic.
Yeah.
And he managed to get all the passengers off safe while the ship burned to the ground.
Wow. Because that's something that's an event that comes up in these poems.
Well, I was 8 years old, standing in the front of our house,
Yeah.
and watching it burn.
Oh, wow.
The docks were right at the end of our street.
So in a poem like this, did these characters, did they loom large initially, or were they ones that you uncovered by thinking about it?
Well, actually, it goes right back to The Village Within, 1968. I used many of the same characters over and over again.
Right. And The Village Within was sort of where it all began with
it all
Point
began,
Edward.
yeah.
So I guess if in the sake of fairness, in the sake of transparency, I chose the poems we were going to focus on today. Were there any that you think I've missed that are worth talking about or reading? Because they're your poems.
Well, there's one on page 86, Indelible.
Okay.
About another of my childhood friends who, because he didn't have a nickname, didn't get into the books, but he was really probably my best friend.
Oh,
Jerry Mara is dead, and all the willows are weeping in Gibbons Park. Their lingering leaves droop like elongated tears in mute remembrance of our shared boyhood, and linked by that liberating bond that keeps a friendship strong and true. We swam each summer away at Canatera Beach and played gratuitous games of shinny on Foster's Pond, slamming our sticks joyfully on the shimmering ice, glad to be young, alive, and together, our friendship written in indelible ink.
That's a beautiful one as well. When did Jerry die, Grandpa?
Sometime in the mid-70s. He was in his 60s, I think, when he died. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that one actually very nearly made my list, so I'm glad we got to it. Jerry is not someone I'd heard of before.
No.
Because he didn't have a nickname.
He didn't have a nickname.
So he didn't make it.
He was just Jerry, and his dad was one of the alcoholics.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, he was a tail gunner. I've written several poems about him.
Okay, I have heard of Jerry before.
Yeah.
Yes.
His dad was the tail gunner, and very few of them survived. They were in a glass bubble, and they got shot off most of the time.
Well, the air crews didn't do well.
He survived the war and took heavily to drink.
Yeah.
And died very young. He was in his late 30s when he died of a heart attack.
Ugh. Yeah, no, and there's another of your great poems where you talk about playing with Jerry and how he took pride in the fact that his dad was a tail gunner.
Yeah.
When in reality, that is, well, there wasn't probably a more horrible job than that.
No, there wasn't.
The air crews didn't do well in general in those days, but tail gunners and then any of those bubble gunners on the bombers just did not do well. That's good. I'm glad we got to touch on that one. That's great, Grandpa. So I guess the question I always ask you, how does it feel to read these poems? I know they're more recent, but how does it make you feel?
I really enjoy reading them aloud.
Mm-hmm.
it's funny. I have perhaps a similar reaction to you when I was just reading through them,
Yeah.
and so on quickly to sort of decide which ones I might like to read. They didn't resonate, but when I read them aloud, they come alive in my mind and almost in my hands.
Yeah. Oh, it's absolutely, and I think I realized that during the course of today.
And I realized that I've had a lot of successful public readings,
Yeah.
and people have come up to me afterwards and said that's the best reading I've ever attended.
Yeah.
It's because there's so much rhythm.
Mm-hmm.
Poetry really is rhythm, and I can't read a lot of modern poetry because it's arrhythmical.
Mm-hmm.
There's no rhythm, rhyme, consonance, alliteration, and all the old devices.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
So what I've attempted to do, I suppose, if you were looking for an aesthetic, is to use some of the old devices in a form that doesn't make them obtrusive.
Mm-hmm.
You can hear the rhymes, but the rhymes are there, and they produce the rhythm of the poem.
And without disrupting the flow of the poem.
Without disrupting the flow of the poem.
Well, Grandpa, it's been great talking to you as always.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah,
I enjoyed it.
I'm glad. It's been a lot of fun today, as always. So, the 3 collections we spoke about today are Tidings, Inundations, and The Blue Flow Below, all available from Black Moss Press in Canada. Now, Grandpa, what's the new collection called?
The Sands of Canatera.
The Sands of Canatera. Oh, I'm just looking at it right here. It's right under my left hand.
Yeah.
The Sands of Canatera. Now, this is self-published, so it won't be for the mass market.
No.
And then you've got another couple coming out from Black Moss.
Yeah, one in the fall and one the next fall.
That's great. Well, I look forward to reading them, and as always, it's been wonderful.
Start to go, but you stop me saying no, no, no. I guess I'll stay on by a little longer.
Well, I hope everybody enjoyed that conversation as much as I enjoyed having it. It really is moving poetry, and it was a new experience to actually both read it aloud and to hear Grandpa read it aloud. I think it really helped me understand how that 3-beat structure worked, and it really brought my enjoyment level of the poems way up. There's a lot of moving stuff in those poems, and I think Grandpa's vulnerability in discussing it was welcome, and it really made me feel good about this project as a whole. I think we're getting to things that matter, and they're helping me understand Grandpa a little better. He's a quiet guy. We haven't talked about a lot of this stuff, but it's time we did, and I'm glad that we get to share that with everybody. So, if, like I said, the point of this podcast was never to dissect or, really tease out every bit of meaning. It's more about enjoying the work. But if you've enjoyed what you've heard, feel free to tell a friend. You can find us on iTunes, and if you can rate, review, and subscribe, it always helps us get our stuff out there. You can also find all of our podcasts at gutteridgeshows.ca. Thank you to Joe Organ and the band Moves for the use of their song A Little Longer for our intro and outro music. You can find Joe Organ on SoundCloud and Moves on Bandcamp. The album is Tape from 2013. It's a great album. Moves is a great band, and Joe Organ is just one of the most lovely people on the planet. So go ahead over and check out Joey's music. He's still cranking it out, and he makes some really wonderful stuff. So I'd really encourage you to go have a look. As far as Grandpa's works go, the 3 that we talked about today, Tidings, The Blue Flow Below, and Inundations, are all in print. The last 2 from Black Moss Press, and the first from, I forget, some other press. But they're all available in Canada in print. I would encourage you to pick them up. I think you'd really enjoy them, and it would make Grandpa really happy too, I'm sure, to see a few units out there in people's hands. Well, it's been lovely having you. Thank you for joining us on There and Then, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Goodbye.
No, no, I guess I'll stay on by a little longer.